Have you ever read an opinion post that gained like a ton of traction on social media? And when you read it totally through, and you got to the end, and you're like, I don't understand any of this. So like maybe you actually went back and you're like, oh, I got to really understand this. So you read it again a second time, and as you read it, you still came to the same conclusion. You're like, I don't understand any of this. But there are tons of comments on it. There are, passionate comments of approval or disapproval, or people are knee-deep in the weeds with the finer points of the post, and they're coming, and you're just so frustrated because you're like, I want to comment on this. I want to engage, but I can't because I have no idea. Now, I'll just tell you that confusion that keeps you from responding and engaging further on social media, that's probably a really good thing, actually, because the reality is your best posts on social media are usually the ones that you type out and then delete, right? So the fact that you're not engaging in a social media post is probably a really good thing. But sometimes we get in that place spiritually. Like sometimes we know that God says something. We know that there's something there, but we just can't really seem to understand what it means or how we engage. And so this happens in a number of different topics, but one of those topics in particular where we can have this confusion is around the idea of experiencing God. So what I want to try to do this morning is I want to try to help lift the fog a little bit on this topic of experiencing God. And so we've been going through this teaching series, Experiencing God, and in week 1, I gave what I call just a working definition of what it means to experience God. So I kind of want to just go back there for a second and just review that for us. I know some of you may be newer to this series, newer to our church, and so I'm just trying to get us a little bit grounded in where we've been to this point. So here's the working definition of to experience God. To experience God is to enjoy a relationship with the Creator God who reveals himself to us and invites us to join him in his mission through our obedience. So let me say that one more time. To experience God is to enjoy a relationship with the Creator God who reveals himself to us and invites us to join him in his mission through our obedience. Last week, Josh Landrum, who was here speaking while I was at my daughter's graduation, he did a great job of giving us 4 key parts to understanding how the Holy Spirit is leading us. And those 4 key parts are God's Word, which we call the Scriptures, sometimes the Bible, and prayer, our circumstances, and other believers or the church. And so those were kind of the 4 key parts to understanding Scripture. This week, what I want to do is I want to take those 4 key parts to the Scriptures, and I want to combine that with a concept that I talked about a few weeks ago as well, the concept of obeying God. And I want to take those two together, and I want to kind of put those two together to help us understand and lift some of the fog that we might have regarding the clarity of experiencing God. And so if you have a Bible, I'd like you to turn to the book of Joshua. So Joshua's in the Old Testament. It goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. And so we're going to be in Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4 this morning. So if you don't have a Bible, that's okay. I'll have the verses on the screen behind me. You can also actually open up the YouVersion Bible app, and you can follow along with us. That way, we'll be using the New International Version. In experiencing God, something that we need to understand, and this comes out in the first 8 verses that we're going to read here this morning. In experiencing God, we have to understand that the confusion that exists can actually be clarified in obedience. In other words, experiencing God finds clarity in obedience. Sometimes the uncertainty, the confusion that we have in how to proceed in our experience of God gets clarified when we take one step of obedience. And so we see this happening in the text here this morning in Joshua chapter 3, and starting in verse 9, here's what the text says. Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage, all during harvest. And yet as soon as the priests who carried the Ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the waters from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. And so here we have in this story, we have an example of individuals who were experiencing God. How were they experiencing God? They heard a command from the Lord, and then they actually obeyed that command. Here's basically what they knew at this point in time, that God had asked them to cross the Jordan River. That's what they knew. And so they obeyed. Here's what they didn't know at the time. They didn't know how all this was going to look, and they didn't know how all this was going to happen and roll out. God had given them some ideas, but they certainly couldn't have had those images in their head. And I should point this out, even though God told them what was going to happen, they didn't have any previous experience to draw from. They had never seen the Jordan River actually stop like they were about to see. They had no previous reference from which they could draw. Now, I don't know about you. I can tell you for sure for me, I'm pretty confident it's about you, but I don't want to be dogmatic because maybe there's an exception. But I know for me, a lack of previous experience will make me hesitate in doing things. And it will, in fact, make me hesitate in doing things, including obeying what God says. It's often a deterrent for me in my obedience. That might be true for you as well. Maybe there's something that you know God is asking you to do this morning, and the reason you're not doing it is because you don't have a lot of experience in it or what's going to happen as a result of that. And so that becomes a deterrent for you in obedience. That is definitely true of me, and that was true as well of the Israelites. But they actually stepped forward anyway. And they understood this about God. They understood that God is truthful and that God is transparent. When he asks us to do something, he doesn't hide it from us, he tells us. But he also reveals himself to us. When he does so, he doesn't typically reveal all of himself to us, and he doesn't typically reveal all his plan to us at once. It usually comes in parts. And he asks us to obey, and then he reveals more. So in this case, God revealed himself in his plan enough for them to actually take one step into the Jordan. And they knew that they needed to obey. But until they actually obeyed, they didn't experience God in the way that they eventually experienced God. It was the basis of their experience was on their obedience as he revealed himself then more and more. The point is that obedience is the key point here, that the key point in our ability to experience God fully is for us to obey him fully, even if we don't always know what all of that will entail. Now, as I think about obedience, practically speaking, I think there's a couple things that stand out to me about obedience as it relates to experiencing God, as it relates to our faith in God. Number one, I think obedience is kind of like a revealer of faith. Like, and the times when we have decisions to make, whether to obey or to not obey, obedience tends to reveal our faith in God. So like I would ask myself the question when I have the opportunity to obey, do I obey and trust God? Or do I not obey and do my own thing? And what we choose to do in those moments is usually a revealer of where our faith lies. So I also think that obedience is also a cultivator of faith. Like when we step out and obey and see how God is at work and we watch God work in our lives, we are actually more willing to obey in the future because we've seen God work in the past. And so, in essence, when we obey, we end up strengthening the trust muscle. Now, I can tell you there have been several moments in my life where I have not obeyed when I've been given the clear opportunity to obey by the Lord, right? So this is not just like me preaching at you and then, oh, I've got it all right. Like this is not the way it works. And I know that there's been times in my life where I have demonstrated a lack of obedience. I have disobeyed. And in those moments, God has actually shown me the contrast, the comparison between what it was to disobey and what it would have been like to obey. And then I can look at that and go, yeah, that was a motivator for me to not continue in disobedience. And that's true. Disobedience can be a motivator for us to actually obey. But I would argue that the greater obedience is to actually obey and experience the joy in real time of obedience. And that actually is a greater motivator and a cultivator of our faith than anything else. Well, let's see exactly what happens in the text as the people obey. At the end of verse 16, here's what it says. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground. That's actually pretty incredible. While all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. So here's the big picture of what's happening in the text. God commands them to cross the river, tells them how to do it. The people respond with obedience, and God shows up and does exactly what he said that he would do. Because the reality is, God always shows up. Every time we obey, God always shows up. And so in their circumstances, their obedience revealed God to them. They got to experience God in a fresh and exciting way. And it started with God's command. It followed with their obedience and ends with them experiencing God in a very real and personal way. Now, in this true story, obedience and disobedience were pretty evident. Like it was clear. You just read the text. It's disobedience and obedience are pretty obvious. But what happens when the lines of obedience and disobedience are less clear, particularly with our circumstances? I told the first service, when I was going through seminary, for some reason, while Greek and Hebrew are the two languages that they have for you in seminary, for some reason for me, Hebrew seemed like it was a much better language for me. And so I don't know if it's because I feel like I'm a backwards person. And so maybe because the Hebrew is right to left, that was great for me. It just needed something that wasn't the normal. But anyway, I would read through the Hebrew grammars, and I still like to read through Hebrew grammars. I don't like English grammars, but I do like Hebrew grammars. And I'd read through the Hebrew grammars, and occasionally at the end of a chapter, they would have something called the excursus. And the excursus was kind of like a discussion about something related, but not directly related to the chapter that was. And so I'm just going to give you this morning a little excursus on this topic of what do we do when the lines of obedience and disobedience are not clear. The text, it makes it clear this morning that in this particular story, they were clear. But there are times in our lives when the lines between obedience and disobedience aren't as clear. In other words, there could be valid options to follow Jesus in many respects. Because not all circumstances that we are going to face have something where it's an obviously right and wrong. It's not always that easy. So how do we know with the circumstances that we meet that we are experiencing God in the way that we should? So let me just offer a couple things. First, and I know this probably goes without saying, but it means all the more that I need to say it. First, make sure that you are obeying where you know you should obey. Even if it's not necessarily, even if the circumstance isn't directly related to that. Just commit yourself to saying, I'm going to obey what I know God wants me to do. And if you commit to that, it is clarity in that particular subject, but it also can be clarity for other subjects as well. Second, and this is something that Josh talked about last week, which I think is really helpful, is the importance of prayer. I find myself as a follower of Jesus in moments like this where I'm like, okay, we need to figure out what to do in this situation, and it's not clear obedience or disobedience. I'm like, oh, we should pray about this. And I find myself talking a lot more about prayer than I actually end up praying. You know what I'm talking about? Like, oh yeah, I should definitely do that. We should definitely pray. This is a clear opportunity to pray. And then I'm like, okay. And then I'm just going to something else. But we actually need to take the time to pray and ask the Lord to give us wisdom and discernment. One of the things that we've talked about prayer is that one of the things that God does in prayer is he doesn't always change circumstances. Sometimes he changes you. Sometimes he crafts you and molds you and works in your life. And as a result of that, it becomes clear what you need to do in the next step in that process. Josh brought up an illustration last week. If you weren't here last week, Josh talked about how there's a family that's considering moving from Kentucky to Florida. My response to that would be in the wintertime, I would say the Lord was leading that all the time. So, but okay, that's not, yeah, that's maybe a little more selfish motivated. So but he was talking about that family, and they were trying to walk through this process of understanding, like, should we do this? Should we not do this? And what does that look like? And so he talked about these 4 key points of the scripture and the prayer and the circumstances and other believers and the counsel from the small group and all that kind of stuff that was really, really helpful in that process. There are a couple questions that you could ask of yourselves in circumstances and situations like this that I think help to ground you. One of those questions could be simply like, what is more likely to draw me closer to Jesus? Whether it's a move, it's a relationship, it's a financial decision, or it's something that I haven't covered. It's just kind of this odd decision. What is more likely to draw me closer to Jesus? If you're married, you have kids, you could ask this question: what will help my family grow more spiritually in this moment? Sometimes we're tempted to just look at the sheer financials when we make decisions and choices. And God wants us to be wise with our finances and stuff like that. That is true. That is very important. But in the situation that Josh presented about moving, even if the person moves to Florida because they're getting twice as much as what they're currently making, okay, that's potentially good. But what about the spiritual community? What about the support structures? What about all those types of things that are really important for your life that you're not thinking about in that moment? Those are questions worth considering. I will tell you that Colleen and I have not gotten everything right in our lives. And the more you get to know us, the more you're like, oh yeah, I totally understand that. Colleen gets more right than I do, but that's why I'm glad I'm married to her. So it works out well. But we've gotten some things right where we've really seen God work in our lives. And I remember our family moving from northeastern Pennsylvania to northern Kentucky 6 years ago is actually a really good example of this. We knew that we needed to be closer to our family. My parents grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, right outside of Scranton. That's why I have so many office references. That's what I keep saying anyway. And they eventually moved to Cincinnati area, to Fairfield, Ohio, to be near my sister and brother-in-law, who were actually living in Pennsylvania and then moved here as well. And so my parents are getting up in years. They were older. They were requiring some care, still able to be sufficient on their own, but you're still trying to navigate this as, like, you want to be good children, good sons, good daughters. And I would get several calls from my sister going, it'd be really nice if you were closer. It would be really helpful if you were closer. And I'm like, okay, maybe the Lord's at work in that way. We also knew that our kids were kind of hitting a spiritual ceiling where we were, and that they needed another place where they could be challenged to grow more spiritually. And so these were conversations that we were having. So some of you know that prior to here, we had started a church in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I'm from Pennsylvania. I love Pennsylvania. I think highly of Pennsylvania. Every time somebody from Philadelphia does something important, I'm very excited about that, and we're fans of that team. I love Pennsylvania. I love the people of Pennsylvania. I loved the church community that God had built, and the name of the church was Centerpoint Community Church, and God was growing the church, and it was going really, really well, and we were excited about that. We loved the people, but as we prayed about it, and as we're talking about this, we just really felt like the Lord was leading us to go somewhere else, and it was kind of pressed upon us in that way. And so, in January of 2014. Is that right? 2019. In January of 2019, Colleen and I sat with the leadership, and we'd been open and transparent about this in the process. We said, we really do think the Lord is leading us to leave. And so they said, well, would you be willing to just share that, what's going on in your life, with the congregation, and that would help us moving forward, and we could potentially look for another pastor and stuff like that. So she said, sure, we'd be happy to do that. So we announced in January that we intended to leave the church. We didn't have another place lined up, right? And so it wasn't like we were like, hey, we're going to be leaving and going here. We're just like, the Lord is asking us to step out in faith and do this. And so we announced that, and it went really, really well. And so that gave the church an opportunity to look for another pastor, and gave us the opportunity to look for what the Lord had for us next without having to be like secretive about it or anything like that. And so it was a really good period of time. It seems weird because most churches don't do that. Like the pastor usually announces, and then 2 weeks later they're gone, right? And so it was unique in that moment, and we were really bonding well. But we were saying, Lord, okay, we're obeying, but where do you want us to go? What do you want us to do next? And so we felt like the next step was that we needed to list our house for sale, because houses, typically don't sell for like 6 or 7 months or whatever, and we didn't want to have a place to go and then still have a house. And so we couldn't afford to have two houses. And so we listed it in the March and April timeframe because we had to get it ready and all that kind of stuff. And so anticipating that this could take up to 6 months, and then within 6 weeks, we had a contract on the house. And so this is May, early May. And so it's really exciting that the Lord had worked in that way. The problem, there's two problems. One, we needed a place to live. That's a really big problem. And two, we had no place to go, right? Because we're still working. There were a couple places that we were looking at, but we didn't really know what to do, and they didn't work out. And so I remember over Memorial Day weekend, the church had actually brought another pastor in who would eventually be the pastor of the church, who's still the pastor of the church today. They brought he and his wife in to visit for the weekend, and we were just wrapping up that visit on a Monday morning at a restaurant, and I got a phone call. And that phone call, I stepped out to get the phone call from the breakfast, and that phone call was from a guy named Travis Kaiser. I'm not sure if that name is familiar to you or not, but he's our lead pastor here now. And he was the teaching pastor at the time, and he said, hey, I just want to reach out. I just want to have a conversation with you to see if you'd be interested. We have a potential role here. And I'm looking at Colleen. I'm like, this is like 45 minutes from my family, which is great because we don't want to be like the Everybody Loves Raymond people that are right next door, but we want to be close enough to get there in a couple minutes. And so so we were really excited about that. And so what ended up happening in all this, we eventually continued the connection, and then in August we spent our last Sunday at Centerpoint, and then the next Sunday was here for the first time. And we look back over that now, and we just look at how the Lord had all that working. He was at work in all of this. I mean, the church Centerpoint was going to hire the guy that we were having breakfast with while Florence was actually contacting me on the phone at the same time, just like the Lord orchestrating stuff. And then August, just the way everything happened. And then I should have mentioned this, that it became a seller's market so much that the buyers were willing to let us stay in the house until August. And so that was like, well, it was really great. So I say that all to say, like, we haven't gotten everything right in our lives. But we knew in that moment that God was leading us to a next chapter, and that obedience was stepping out on faith. And we did what we knew that we had to do in that moment to be obedient, and then God revealed the rest along the way. And that's how God works for us. And we experience God tremendously. I mean, I can't stand spending the night at anyone else's house at all. Like, even as a kid, I was like, I'm not spending the night at somebody else's house. I got my bed for a reason. I like it. I'm not going to do that. I had no bed for like a month while we were in this process, and yet I was totally fine with that. This is, again, how God works. Every step along the way, God was working. But it starts with God leading us to do something and us being willing to say, yes, I will obey. And my story looks way different than your story, but the structure is still the same. God's call, your obedience, you will experience God in a great way. And the thing about God is that sometimes the dots, you're like, these dots do not connect. But you don't have to connect the dots. God's the one that'll connect the dots. You just have to obey and let God work those things out. So here are some questions that you can ask yourself as you're kind of navigating this like lines of obedience and lines of disobedience, trying to figure out, okay, well, maybe either's a good choice. Here are some questions you can ask yourself. Like, what decision best helps me to join God in his mission? What decision will lead me to holy living? What decision will put me on the best spiritual course in the future? And you say, well, Neal, I don't intend to moving. That's good, because I actually don't want you to move. I really would prefer you guys stay here. But these apply to other decisions as well, too. Who will I date? Who will I marry? Where will I go to school? What is my next job? Who will I meet in the community? Where will I involve my kids? All these types of things that we have that come up. These are helpful questions as you encounter those things as well. I also think another set of questions is important because I think you and I need to drill down on our motivations, because motivations are a key part of what it means to obey God. And so you can ask yourself this question: why do I want to do this? Why do I want to move? Why do I want to date this person? Why do I want to go to this school? What is my motivation behind it? Are my motives in line with the mission of God for my life? Is personal comfort or spiritual growth the primary motive in what I'm trying to do? See, a lot of times where I have disobeyed the Lord in those moments because I have put my personal comfort ahead of my spiritual growth. And so we just have to kind of constantly monitor those things. Now, I'll say this. You can get all the way through those lines of questions. You can get all the way to the end, and you can look at the choices that you have, and you can go, Neal, you know what? I still look at this and go, I think any of these choices are good options. Like choice A and choice B and choice C, they're all good options. And that can happen. And I would just simply say this: if you're following Jesus with your life, if you're obeying God with what you know to be true, and the choices presented to you, there are still multiple good options, then you can actually feel confident in going in with any of those options. You know, sometimes I think that we make God's will and our experiencing of God too difficult, too complex, like trying to find the Holy Grail or something like that. And so we're like sitting at a car dealership knowing that we need a car, and we're like, well, does God want me to buy the blue car or the red car? They're the same car. They have the same mileage. They're pretty much the same price. Well, which one does God want me to buy? And my response to you in that moment is, you way overthought this. If you've prayed about it and both are legitimate options, then you can buy either one and pursue God and enjoy the fruits of God's good gifts in that way. And so I want to encourage you, as you're thinking through this process of experiencing God, you obey what you know, you continue to stay clean and close to the Lord, and then you might actually have options of which way to go. And these are great examples for us as we think through this idea of disobedience and obedience. Okay, so in chapter 3, Joshua tells us that we can actually discern where there are clear lines of obedience and disobedience. We actually get clarity, and we can avoid confusion. The fog gets lifted as we obey with what we know. In chapter 4, we see a second piece, and that's this: experiencing God may be personal, but it is not private. Experiencing God may be personal, but it is not private. Notice verses 1-3. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. The obedience of the Israelites was on public display as we see them grabbing the stones and putting them on public display. God's work in public and our obedience in joining him is also on display, and that is all so that people can be attracted to his greatness. One of the low-key great ways that you can introduce people to the greatness of God is by simply obeying God in your life with what you know that he wants you to do. Because what will happen in that moment is people will see you experiencing God, and they will want to experience God for themselves. And so that's what's going on in the text here. The people are experiencing God, and they took physical markers so that they could remember what God had done in their lives, and so that other people around them would then see what God had done in their lives. Notice what happens in verse 4. So Joshua called together the 12 men, and he had them appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and he said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of Israel, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." So, the text is clear that these stones are meant to be public reminders of God's faithfulness. And then he doesn't say if your children ask you one day. He says when your children ask you one day. See, here's the really cool thing, cool thing is a weird way to say that. Here's the great thing for you if you are a parent in the room this morning. Here's the great thing for you if you are a grandparent in the room this morning. You have the opportunity to influence your children and your grandchildren for eternity by experiencing God in your life through your personal obedience. It will be a marker to others of how great God is. It will attract to others the greatness of God in their lives, and they will want to follow. They will ask, "Hey, why is this here? Why did this happen in your life? What's this marker for?" And you can point them back to something that God did in your life that is clear cut for you. When you experience God in your life, they will want to then experience God in theirs as well. Some of us are introverted people by nature, and that I love introverts. I am an introvert. I love that. That's great. And if you're not an introvert, it's okay too. You're awesome too. I married an extrovert. It's wonderful, all right? But some of us are introverts, and we want to do everything privately. Even when we've not done anything wrong at all, we just want to do it privately. We want nobody to see it, nobody to know it, nobody to do it. But if your faith and your experiencing of God is all private and nobody sees it, you're going to miss out on one of the great joys of experiencing God, which is helping others experience him as well. So lean into that. Lean into obeying God. You don't have to stand up and go, "Hey, look, I just obeyed God right over here. Check me out. Come experience God with me." People will see it naturally through the relationships that you have. And most importantly, so will your children and your grandchildren. Now, let me give you 3 application points that will be done this morning. Number 1, to the thing of physical markers. Physical markers of God's faithfulness can be great tools for our spiritual growth. There's a reason why at every conference they're constantly giving you weird swag, and obviously some of that stuff is from sponsors and stuff like that, but sometimes they give you these unique things, and you're like, "Oh man, I'm going to put this away because this conference was meaningful in my life, and I'm going to continue to remember this." There's reasons why in the scriptures there are physical markers. And there's reasons why we do that today. And I encourage you, as you see God work in your life, one of the things that you can really do is you can grab a physical marker, stick it in a noticeable place as a consistent reminder in the future of how God showed up in your life. And that can be very beneficial for your spiritual growth and the spiritual growth of others. Number 2, the next step in our spiritual journey is always connected to the previous work of God in our lives. This is why it's important to obey with what you know, because God's going to do things on the basis of your obedience down the road in the future. Right in the Experiencing God book, it says this: when God gets ready for you to take a new step or direction in his life, it will always be in sequence with what he has already been doing in your life. But God doesn't do radically separate things. What he's already got going on in your life, that's the seed through which he is going to do greater things in the future. So the next step is going to come out of what God is already doing in your life. And the third thing, obedience to God can be contagious. Obedience to God can be contagious. Whether you're a parent in the room or you're a friend, whether it's in a relationship, whatever it looks like, your obedience to God not only strengthens your trust muscle, but it can strengthen others as well. And you don't have to be an idiot about it. You can just do it, and people will be attracted to it in our world today. Don't miss out on the joy of personal obedience that leads others to join in as well. So I hope this has been a good Sunday to connect a couple of things that we've been talking about over the course of the last couple of weeks together. Will you join me in prayer?